Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 8 of This Week in FCPA for the week ending Friday, June 10th. In this episode, my friend and colleague Jay Rosen and I take a deep dive into the 2 declinations and non-prosecution agreements given to Akamai Technologies and Nortek this week. Very interesting cases, and we both think very significant cases for the compliance practitioner going forward. Jay was involved in this case as the translation service provider, so he gives us some insights on how translations work into an FCPA investigation going forward. I focus on the remedial steps that the companies took to garner both the declination and the NPA. As usual, the episode comes in at just around 30 minutes. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you very much for listening. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA. I'm with my good friend and colleague, Jay Rosen. Jay, how are you this morning?
I'm doing great, calling in from the place where it never rains, Los Angeles, California.
So it never rains. You know, I think at one point I'm going to have to do a one-hit wonders series, and it never rains in Southern California. Seasons in the Sun will certainly be one of those one-hit wonders. I don't know why that song is burned into my brain, but it is.
That is too funny, because I was thinking about Terry Jackson, Season in the Sun, and I played it for Rebecca, and she'd never heard the song before.
Yeah, Terry Jacks. For those who want to go back to the 70s, he one-hit wonder from the 70s, had this huge afro, yet a white guy, and really stuck out, but we had a huge hit. One of many interesting tales to tell. And I was on a podcast last week with Allison Taylor, and she was actually in Woodstock when we were recording, and she complimented me as that rock and roll compliance blogger. So I thought that was cool. So anyway, Jay, we had a extraordinarily interesting week in the FCPA, largely because of 2 cases. And I think probably both of us want to spend most of the episode talking about that after you catch your phone.
Yep. And of course, it's not taking my fingertip swipe. Hang on. Okay.
So we had a extraordinarily interesting couple of cases. It involved 2 entities, one from your former neck of the woods, Akamai Technologies, and then a second company, Nortek. Both of these companies came to grief over their actions of their subsidiaries and partners in China. And the thing that was notable really was 2 things. First of all, the Department of Justice issued a written declination. So it's pretty unusual for companies to get a declination, not unknown certainly, but unusual. But also the public release of the letter from the Department of Justice. And then both companies also got non-prosecution agreements, or what we call NPAs, from the Securities and Exchange Commission. So maybe what were some of your initial impressions?
Well, one of the things that I was curious about was earlier this year when the pilot program was announced, was whether they were going to apply it to decisions that or investigations that had been pending, or if there's going to be this 1-year period going forward. So I think it's very interesting now that they're applying the pilot program to an ongoing investigations. And I think it's quite interesting that both of these, cases came out simultaneously. And I think there's, I wouldn't call it so much a clear line, but I would say that there is definitely more incentives now for why a company might want to come forward and, cooperate. And these seems to be, allaying some of the fears that they had that if a company gives up privilege and starts cooperating, giving up names, that it's going to put them in a bad position. So I think this is definitely a great way to start things off with the pilot program and to really incentivize people in the community to take advantage of it.
I have to agree with that. The in the letter released by Daniel Kahn, that he sent to both companies, he specifically noted that there was a bribery of employees in China, or bribery by employees, I should say, in China by the company's subsidiary and of channel partners, but that even in spite of this violation of the FCPA, there were a number of factors which led the department to grant a declination. So these factors really followed the pilot program, and I'm going through a blog post series where in today's post I really took the actions the companies engaged in and tried to map them to the pilot program so that you could see what they did specifically under the four general requirements of the pilot program. And those four requirements are that you voluntarily self-disclose, that you extensively cooperate during the pendency of the investigation, and then also you remediate during the investigation, and finally that you disgorge the profits you have received. So both parties did this. They both self-disclosed, and I have to go to the glasses here to read what I wrote. But the Nortek identified payments through an internal investigation, and they self-disclosed that. But even more interestingly, I thought was is it Akamai?
I've always said Akamai, but
Akamai. Okay, well, we'll go with you since you're the homer here. And it says, and it's a homer company. So speaking of which, your Red Sox just sucked this week. The company was made aware of allegations to an internal whistleblower, and then they disclosed to the Department of Justice even before the investigation was complete. So that really speaks to the part of the Yates memo part of the pilot program where they talked about self-disclosure and its importance, and the Department of Justice clearly gave credit to that. So you're going to have to self-disclose. I recognize that's a difficult decision. I had an interesting talk with Mike Volkov about this issue yesterday. And if you've ever heard Mike talk about the issue of disclosure, he has been one of the strongest advocates that in addition to not taking the decision to self-disclose lightly, which I don't think anyone does, Mike really advocated the need not to self-disclose in many situations. And those situations are as follows, where you have a really discrete failure which led to the conduct which violated the FCPA, meaning it's not systemic, but you can go in and you can remediate that conduct, whether that be terminating the employees involved, terminating the channel partners involved, whichever it might be, and then move forward to also manage that risk going forward by putting in additional internal controls and protections around that. Basically, if you clean up the situation, it's not systemic, and you document that, so that if a regulator ever does come knocking, you have a record of it. You may not need to self-disclose. And I should also say if the conduct does not go up to a senior management level. But here, and this was a point of my conversation with Mike, that here your dynamic, or at least your calculus, may change, your decision-making calculus, because it may be now that before, when you would not have self-disclosed, you may now move towards a self-disclosure because you're going to get such high credit for it. And clearly they got high credit for it here in terms of everything I articulated. It was, they did a thorough investigation. It was not systemic. It did not rise to the level of senior management. They terminated the parties involved. They terminated the employees involved, and they fixed it. So, stop, find, and fix. They fixed it, and they put in appropriate protections that the government thought were appropriate for the situation. So it really may add a different factor if companies know that they can have a very, very strong case to make, or strong ability to get a declination. Of course, you're going to have to give the profits back, and I don't know if you were able to, so I wanted to pitch this question to you, Jay. Mm-hmm. Were you able to make a determination of the specific contracts that were tied to the profits, because I just could not really glean the business that was obtained from the illegal conduct directly to profits.
Yeah, I wasn't able to locate that either. I wanted to back up for a second with your discussion that you had with Volkov. Is it okay to call him by his last name, or
Sure.
just okay? Um, when you do this, is it sufficient to run an internal investigation, or do you need to, from your perspective, involve outside counsel to get some independence to make sure when you're noting what you've done in the process and how you remediated? Is it fine to do that in-house, or do you think you need a level of independence too before you do that?
Well, I might have thought about it a little differently, because when I say internal investigation, I just automatically in my mind include external counsel.
Okay.
I think you should always consider external counsel for two reasons. One is privilege, and clearly separating that attorney-client privilege out from the corporate setting. You still have the privilege in the corporate setting, but it can be the lines can be blurred and more fuzzy because of oftentimes the legal department may be giving something close to business advice. The second thing is you really need very focused professional investigative counsel, and that means people who do this for a living. And there are corporations that are large enough to have a professional investigative staff, and certainly I think we probably both could name several companies who have that talent in-house. Many companies don't, and they need to really consider in a situation where potentially you're looking at a FCPA violation, which could lead to multiple fines, penalties, and costs. You want to bring in the top talent you can to do that investigation. People who've done it before, ex-prosecutors who think like prosecutors, who understand what prosecutors are looking for. For all of those reasons, I think having external counsel in FCPA investigations is certainly a way to consider going, and it may be going. And we should also add, and particularly since you're Mr. Translations, you've got to have other professional service advisors and providers on the ready to assist. And if you're in China, you're going to need translation services. If you're looking at accounting records, you're going to need forensic accountant types. And bringing those folks in is part of what a top-notch investigative firm does, but it's also the clear delineation of who you're working for as an external service provider. If you're contracted with a law firm, they know there's pretty clear that the privilege is going to exist. So there's a wide variety of reasons I think it's important in significant FCPA investigations to bring in outside counsel, to bring them in as early as possible and get them involved. But you can do, I know several companies will investigate internally. I believe Ropes and Gray was the firm involved in here as they were identified. And they've even, I think, given
we might even know the translation company that might have worked on that matter.
Well, I didn't know if we could disclose that information publicly, but if we do, I think it would be an appropriate time to talk about how a translation service provider would work into this type of matter.
Sure. So basically, what's going to happen, we've always, I've discussed the cinematic thing of boots on the ground and collecting hard drives and, doing a litigation hold, but specifically how I try to get my clients to think about where translation plugs into these multilingual and multinational investigations is more often than not, they're going to involve some type of e-discovery process. So once they've worked through the investigation and they've got the documents that are responsive, at that point, they're probably going to need to present them to either the DOJ, the SEC, or the audit committee. And most of the time, they're going to want to have a professional translation, and they're going to want to have these documents certified. So a really good LSP, language solutions provider, should have that ability to basically do an electronic handshake. And what I mean by that is that they will tell the forensics company or the company that's hosting the data how to actually format the load files. The LSP would come in and sweep the tool, take the information out, translate it, and then return it back in, and you'd have two copies. You'd have the original document in Chinese, and then you would have the English translation, and they would both either be identified by a Bates number, and it might have a dash SCH for simplified Chinese or a dash ZE for Chinese. And then you're going to have the ability to put these documents up side by side on computer screens. So you can see the source document in Chinese and then the English translation. So to really have the ability to work with somebody who technically gets it, and you're not having to reinvent the wheel. And quite often when we find ourselves involved in some of these global investigations, it's the same law firm, the same big four company. And I liken this back to when I was in the movie business. It's getting the band back together again. And there's a certain shorthand that you have when you've worked on these matters. You know exactly what you need to do. And especially if time is at the essence, you can set these things up and really hit the ground running.
I'm sure it didn't upset you too much when one of the factors that the Securities and Exchange Commission specifically noted in both NPAs was that the company, quote, voluntarily translating documents from Chinese into English.
Yes.
So I certainly thought of you when I saw that. But it raises a really important part of one of the things I wanted to try to speak on, which is there's a wide variety of services in any investigation. There's a wide variety of service providers. It's not just a law firm going out and interviewing people. There's technical expertise needed. There's a financial expertise needed. There may be other types of experts needed that a law firm may be more well suited to bring to bear. So, but kudos to the law firm Ropes and Gray. Kudos to the companies as well. But they also there was a large part in both NPAs about the company's remedial actions, and I wanted to go through those. So when it came to Nortek, they revised their internal testing and protocols. They strengthened their entire policies and procedures. They developed a compliance committee consisting of representatives from management and subsidiaries to supervise compliance, implementation of Nortek's net compliance policies and training. This is the first time I'd seen a compliance committee which consisted of representatives of management and subsidiaries. So typically when you have a compliance committee, it's either senior execs, kind of at the C-suite level, perhaps a level below that, and they sit between the chief compliance officer and the audit committee. But here we had I was really intrigued by having subsidiaries involved in the compliance committee. And this is something that I think many companies may want to consider because implementation of your compliance program, or as Jay Martin would say, that's where the rubber hits the road in compliance. Did you implement it? And by bringing in representatives from the subsidiaries, I think that would help a company to understand how they are doing business outside of the United States, what are the challenges, and bring answers to those problems or to those issues that might not be self-evident if you're sitting in the corporate office in the United States. Also, there were more training and for employees in, quote, appropriate languages, please note, and they adjusted their internal audit schedules. As to Akamai.
Whatever works for you.
Whatever works for me. So they implemented comprehensive due diligence processes for their channel partners. Now, channel partner, for those who don't know, is really just a third party who's involved typically on the sales side of things. It was their channel partner who was paying the bribe, or was funded through the parent company. So they specifically were going to sign up to do channel partner risk assessments, strengthen their overall policy. They named a chief compliance officer. Never a good thing when in 2016 you're naming your first chief compliance officer. But they staffed a global team around the world, did training, and enhanced travel and expense control around China. Really what I got out of that NPA, Jay, was pretty clear they didn't have a very robust program when the allegations, or not allegations, the incidents underlying the FCPA violations took place. And so they played catch up in a hurry. Typically, if you don't have a full compliance program in place, you're not going to receive the fullest credit, meaning get a declination. So I found it interesting that they received a declination, even though I would have to opine at this point, did not have an effective compliance program in place at the time of the incidents in question. I think the Department of Justice and SEC have a comfort level that they either have or are moving very quickly and closely to having that now. So that's another, I think, important lesson that people would need to learn, that you can make a comeback, and you can make a comeback if you're really dedicated to making that comeback. And if that comeback is such that you get a declination from criminal violations of the from the Department of Justice under the FCPA, and an NPA, a non-prosecution agreement from Securities and Exchange Commission, that's a very, very powerful signal on what that part of what it means to have extensive remediation.
So I think it's very clear what the message is to the marketplace. I think where I'm still getting kind of hung up, and I'm not sure if you did this about 6 months or a year ago, but you had a couple interviews with Mara Sen when she was in private practice, and
right.
Now she's gone to the government, and there was some real aggressive arguments about why not to self-disclose. If you kind of think back to that series vis-a-vis, what do you think changes now with the calculus and with, what we're pulling out of these two situations? Why can you make the argument that you should self-disclose, or why do you go back with what Mike Volkov was saying, is that if you fix it in-house, that's sufficient enough?
Well, I thought Mara's views were really based on the downsides of self-disclosure, and it was the cost you were going to have to go through, and really the difficult process, not knowing at the end of the day really where it might take you. Volkov's, although at the end the resulting argument may be the same, I thought his focus was a little bit different, because he was really focused on cleaning up the problem rather than so much of self-disclosure. Mara really focused on the negative implications or results of self-disclosure, and I thought Mike really took it a different way, although they both came down pretty strongly on in the appropriate circumstances not self-disclosing, recognizing could be a very big risk. Nevertheless, the calculus that changes from both Mara Sen's positions, or our discussions perhaps, and Mike Volkov's, is that now there is a clear roadmap of what you should do. Maybe that's the Volkov position. And in response to Mara's concerns, I think it's clear that the department will credit the Department of Justice, if we leave the SEC out of it just for a second, because that's a different type of enforcement. The Department of Justice enforcing the criminal components of the FCPA, thou shalt not bribe part. If thou does bribe, though, you might be able to receive a declination if you meet the guidelines of the Yates memo and more further articulated in the pilot program. And I think this really does change the calculus, and it changes the concerns that perhaps Mara articulated more than Mike Volkov did on the negative consequences, because here we have the head of the FCPA section, Daniel Kahn, quite clearly saying that bribes were paid, and pretty clear to me FCPA violations occurred. Bribes were paid in violation of the FCPA. Nevertheless, the department gave him a pass in the form of a public declination. So I think that does change the calculus.
So one of my favorite shows that I listen to on Fridays on NPR is something called Left, Right, and Center. And I don't know if you ever heard that show. I just want to kind of give you a softball for the contrarian point of view and bring up our good friend who is probably, I guess, with vis-a-vis FCPA, he's on the left, right? He's so far left, he might not even be on this plane of the universe. He might have dipped over the side. But I think one of the things that I gleaned from his take on what happened was that was he questioning whether or not the companies or the government revealed the declination. Do you recall that part of his what he was writing?
I don't.
Okay, he was taking issue. So, from a
Right.
contrarian point of view, what do you think about where he has issues with what happened?
Well, of course, we're talking about the FCPA professor, and the professor really didn't think much of either the declination, the claims that there was a potential FCPA violation either. So he either thought it was no deal, not a big deal, or just a complete smokescreen. I think from the compliance practitioner's perspective, this is a huge deal. And it's a huge deal because it specifically lays out what you need to do to get the stunning result of a declination where you have bribes paid in violation of the FCPA. And even the fine and penalty, not to say that, of course, in your case, several $100,000 is, not much. But for the rest of us, that's real money. And so we had a fine. We had relatively low fines. I don't think I have the numbers in front of me, but one was 600,000 plus, and I think one was about 180 or 190.
It's almost the amount that you paid for those Super Bowl trophies behind you, right?
Almost, yeah. So you should see my custom signed Batmobile with Burt Ward and Adam West sign.
Holy collectibles, Batman.
Yeah, holy collectibles. Yeah, we went all out. I even got a lightsaber signed by James Earl Jones now. I am your father. But the fine paid, and we really can't even call it a fine because it's labeled profit disgorgement, is extraordinarily low for FCPA cases. So not to say that's not a lot of money, and in either situation, and I don't want to say that it's not. Nevertheless, the money paid was quite low, and I think it really incentivizes companies to change their thinking on self-disclosure. And also, it really lays out what you need to do for remediation during the investigation. I'm going to give Ropes and Gray kudos on the investigation and consider them really the leaders that led both companies through this process on the investigation. And if they did the remediation or advised on that, double kudos as well. So from the compliance practitioner's perspective, from the chief compliance officer, everyone needs to read these NPAs. They need to read the letters from Dan Kahn. Everything's available in the public record. And if one day I can figure out how to attach documents to show notes, I will put those in these show notes. But if I can't figure it out, you can go to my blog post on this subject, and I'll have them all attached on Monday, where I conclude with the specific lessons, really taking some of the thoughts that we've had here and expanding on them. So from the compliance practitioner's perspective, I think this is a hugely important case. It communicates exactly what the department has said they're going to communicate, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's double kudos to the law firm involved and the companies for doing the right thing and garnering this results. We've really gone off a long time on this. We've got just a few minutes. So any closing thoughts?
I was just, while you were just kind of going over this, I was just kind of thinking of the timeline. And when they released the updated FCPA guidance when Chuck DeRoss was over there, was that 2013 or 2014?
Well, there is no updated FCPA guidance. There's
no, okay. So if you kind of think that came out in 2012 and you still have people who are making decisions in the marketplace saying, well, now I have some examples, but I still don't know what's going to happen. And then we bring in the, I don't want to butcher her name, the new compliance person at DOJ, bring in Wei Chen. And now you have these declinations, which go public with NPAs. I mean, I think, and then somewhere back there about a year ago, you got the Yates memo. So I think that if you're in compliance now, there really is not a good argument that you can't know what is right from wrong and what you need to do. Because I think over the past 3 to 4 years, the DOJ and the SEC have really done a great job responding to the marketplace and giving them key hallmarks and guideposts that they can work with to help them decide whether or not they've got a situation that's worth bringing forward.
You know, Jay, that's a great insight. I think I'm going to have to write a white paper on that, tying the Yates memo to the hiring of the compliance counsel, Wei Chin, to the pilot program, and now we have this. I thought things were bookended with the pilot program, but you have just really intrigued me that it may be this case, maybe the bookend, but not as the closing of a book, really as the opening of a new chapter in FCPA enforcement. That's a really great insight. I hadn't really thought about Wei Chin's role in this, but she may have been quite involved in evaluating the steps taken for remediation of each company's compliance program. So good insight.
Hey, you know, every once in a while, a squirrel finds a nut, right?
Well, Jay, unfortunately, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we're going to have to say sign off for this week, but it's been great fun, and I look forward to visiting with you next week.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend.